Prison food that sparked Alcatraz 1946 riot. The men had been quiet for too long. In a place like Alcatraz, silence wasn't peace. It was pressure building behind a wall with no release valve. Stay with this story. What surfaces next took federal investigators decades to fully understand. It was May 2, 1946. Dawn had barely broken over San Francisco Bay when Associate Warden E.J. Miller noticed something that stopped him mid-step in the corridor outside the dining hall. The breakfast trays were coming back full. Not partially eaten, not picked over. That had never happened before. At Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, food wasn't just sustenance. It was the one thing the Bureau of Prisons had publicly promised to get right. The rulebook was specific. Inmates at Alcatraz would receive meals that met or exceeded the dietary standards of the United States Army. That was the official policy. It was printed. It was signed. It was displayed. What was actually being served was something else entirely. Miller had been on the island for 6 years. He knew the rhythms of the men, the way tension moved through a cell block like a current. He knew the difference between a bad day and a breaking point. What he was seeing that morning wasn't discontent. It was coordinated refusal. He flagged it in his daily log. One line: meal return rate unusually high. Will monitor. He did not escalate. He did not file a formal report. That single decision would cost the federal government 2 days, 2 lives, and the complete loss of control over the most secure prison in America. To understand what the men were refusing, you have to understand what Alcatraz food had become by 1946. In the early years of the federal penitentiary, it opened under federal control in 1934. The food program was genuinely considered a model. Warden James Johnston had made it a cornerstone of his philosophy. His logic was straightforward and, for its time, surprisingly progressive. A fed inmate is a manageable inmate. Hungry men are angry men. Johnston pushed for 3 hot meals a day. Vegetables, protein, bread baked on the island. Portions were not restricted. Men could return for seconds. The dining hall operated on a strict silence rule, but the food itself was designed to be one of the few dignities the men were allowed to keep. Former inmates from that era, interviewed decades later by prison historians, consistently described the early Alcatraz kitchen as producing food that was, by institutional standards, genuinely decent. That era ended quietly, without announcement. By the mid-1940s, the budget pressures of wartime had begun grinding into every corner of federal spending, including corrections. Supply chains were disrupted. Quality controls loosened. Kitchen staff turnover increased. And a new, rotating cast of administrators brought with them a different philosophy, one that viewed the earlier food standards not as policy, but as generosity that had never been deserved. The change was gradual enough that no single meal marked the shift. But the men noticed. Meat that had once been identifiable became a gray, compressed mass that smelled of age. Vegetables arrived overcooked to the point of disintegration. Bread grew dense and sour. The coffee, always weak, became almost ceremonial in its uselessness. Complaints moved through the inmate population the only way communication could on Alcatraz. Carefully, quietly, in the few permitted moments of contact during yard time and work assignments. One of those men was Bernard Paul Coy. Coy was 46 years old, a Kentucky-born bank robber serving 26 years. He was not a man known for ideology or leadership. Prison records described him as cooperative, unremarkable, a man who kept to himself. Guards considered him low risk. But Coy had been watching. And Coy had been listening. He had spent months cataloging what the men around him discussed when the guards were far enough away. Work details, guard rotations, cell block schedules. And underneath all of it, threading through every conversation like a live wire, was the food. It wasn't simply hunger. It was the specific indignity of being promised something and then having it quietly taken away with no acknowledgement, no explanation, and no recourse. The men had no union, no grievance process, no voice. What they had was time and proximity to everything that kept the island running. Coy did not talk about revolt. He talked about leverage. That morning, when the trays came back full, Miller logged it and moved on. But inside D block, Coy looked at the untouched food on his own tray, then looked at the men around him, and what passed between them required no words. The moment investigators later identified as the true beginning of the 1946 Battle of Alcatraz wasn't the moment a weapon was raised or a guard was overpowered. It was a full breakfast tray, returned untouched, on the morning of May 2nd. But when they checked the meal logs against the kitchen supply records from the previous 8 months, cross-referencing what had been ordered, what had been delivered, and what had actually reached the inmates' plates, everything changed. The supply records didn't lie. But someone had been hoping no one would look closely enough to notice. When investigators finally pulled the Alcatraz kitchen logs from January through April of 1946, what they found wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a single act of corruption or one catastrophic failure. It was something more unsettling, a slow, methodical erosion documented in plain numbers on government-issued forms that nobody with authority had bothered to read. The budget allocated per inmate, per day, had been quietly reduced 3 times in 14 months. Each reduction was small enough to seem administrative, routine, the kind of line-item adjustment that gets initialed and filed without a second thought. But compounded across 260 inmates, across 90 days, the math told a different story. The men were receiving, on average, 34% fewer calories than federal policy required. 34%. That figure never made it to Warden Johnston's desk. By 1946, Johnston, the architect of the original food program, had been replaced. The new administration operated with a different set of priorities, and the kitchen had become, in the institutional language of the time, an optimized cost center. What that meant in practice: fewer staff, lower-grade supply contracts, and a reporting structure that allowed kitchen supervisors to self-certify compliance with dietary standards. Nobody was checking their work. The man signing off on those certifications every week was kitchen supervisor Harold Deering, a civilian contractor who had taken the position in 1944 and, according to colleagues interviewed after the riot, had never once been asked to produce documentation supporting his compliance claims. He was trusted because it was easier to trust him than to verify. Inside the cell blocks, the consequences of that paperwork gap were being felt in the most immediate way possible. Inmates on work assignments, the laundry, the machine shop, the dock detail, were performing physical labor on nutritional intake that would have been insufficient for a sedentary person. By early 1946, the prison's own medical officer had logged a notable increase in fatigue-related complaints, minor injuries during work assignments, and what the records called episodes of agitation during the evening lockdown hours. He filed those observations in the medical wing's internal log. He did not connect them to the kitchen records. No one did. The logs existed in separate departments. There was no system requiring them to be read together. And in the rigid, siloed bureaucracy of a federal penitentiary in 1946, nobody was positioned to see the full picture. Nobody on the staff side, any. Bernard Coy saw it clearly. He had spent the better part of 2 years working in the library, one of the few assignments at Alcatraz that afforded a man proximity to paperwork, schedules, and the quiet observation of institutional patterns. He wasn't supposed to have access to administrative documents. But a prison library is a porous place, and men talk, and Coy had learned to listen with precision. He knew the guard rotation schedules better than some of the guards did. He knew which cell block doors had mechanical lag, a half-second delay between the control room lever and the physical lock engaging, because he had watched the maintenance requests pile up unfilled for months. And he knew that the growing hunger among the men wasn't random misfortune. It was a choice someone had made, quietly, in an office the inmates would never see. That knowledge did something to Coy that pure deprivation alone might not have accomplished. It gave the anger a direction. On the afternoon of May 2nd, approximately 6 hours after the untouched breakfast trays had been returned, Associate Warden Miller received a second signal he chose not to escalate. A guard on the B block afternoon rotation reported that 3 inmates had refused to move from the dining hall after the lunch period ended. They weren't aggressive. They weren't loud. They simply sat. It took 2 additional officers and a direct order from a senior guard to move them. The incident was logged as a minor compliance issue. Miller reviewed the log entry that evening, noted that the situation had been resolved without physical incident, and made no further inquiry. He did not ask what the men had said during those minutes of refusal. He did not ask whether they had spoken to each other beforehand. He did not ask whether anyone else had been present and watching from the line. Coy had been in that dining hall. He had watched all three men hold their ground. He had watched the guards' response, how many came, how long it took, which posts they left to get there. He filed it away. What happened next has been reconstructed from guard testimony, inmate accounts collected in the years following, and the Bureau of Prisons' own internal post-riot investigation, a document that was not made public for nearly 2 decades. At approximately 2:07 p.m. on May 2nd, Coy and 2 other inmates, Marvin Hubbard and Joseph Kretzer, moved into position near the gun gallery on the west end of the cell house. What followed would shut down the most secure prison in the United States for 41 hours. But the post-riot investigation, when it was finally declassified, revealed something the Bureau had not included in any public statement. The escape attempt, because that is what it formally became, had not been the original plan. The original plan had been a demonstration, a coordinated work stoppage, a refusal, organized across multiple cell blocks simultaneously, designed to force an administrative review of prison conditions, specifically food and nutrition standards. Somewhere between the planning and the execution, that plan collapsed. The investigation identified the moment it collapsed down to a 23-minute window on the afternoon of May 2nd. But it could not, or would not, identify why. The relevant section of the report was redacted. 4 lines, blacked out, in the middle of page 31. What those 4 lines contained changed the entire meaning of what happened on Alcatraz that week. And when a retired Bureau of Prisons administrator finally spoke about them 40 years later, in a recorded interview that was never broadcast, what he described was not an escape. It was a message. One the Bureau had received, understood, and chosen to bury. 40 years is a long time to keep a secret. But institutions are patient. And the Bureau of Prisons had learned, long before 1946, that the most effective way to manage an uncomfortable truth was not to destroy it, but to delay it until the people who lived it were no longer alive to contradict the official version. That strategy almost worked. The recorded interview was conducted in 1986 by a criminology researcher at UC Berkeley named David Ferris. He had spent 3 years tracking down former Bureau of Prisons employees for an oral history project on mid-century federal incarceration. Most of the men he found were reluctant. Some refused entirely. One agreed. His name has never been publicly confirmed. In Ferris's notes, he is identified only as R.M., a retired mid-level administrator who had worked in the Bureau's Washington office during the 1940s and had been, by his own description, adjacent to the aftermath of the Alcatraz riot investigation. He was 79 years old when they spoke. He had been diagnosed months earlier with a terminal illness. Ferris would later write that RM seemed less interested in confession than in precision, in making sure that at least one accurate account existed somewhere, even if it never surfaced publicly. What RM described took Ferris 3 sessions to fully document. The 4 redacted lines on page 31 of the Bureau's internal investigation report did not contain evidence of a conspiracy. They did not name a corrupt official or reveal a cover-up in the conventional sense. What they contained was a summary of a document that had been submitted to the Alcatraz Administrative Office on April 14, 1946, 18 days before the riot began. That document was a formal grievance. Handwritten. 3 pages. Signed by 34 inmates. It cited specific dates, specific meals, and specific nutritional deficiencies. It referenced, by number, the federal dietary policy the prison was required to uphold. It requested an administrative review and an independent inspection of the kitchen supply records. It was, by any institutional measure, a legitimate filing. Measured. Documented. Non-threatening. The grievance was received, logged, and forwarded to the warden's office. It was never acknowledged. It was never reviewed. No response was issued. 18 days later, the riot began. RM told Ferris that the existence of that grievance document was the reason 4 lines were redacted from the post-riot report. Not because it proved criminal negligence, though legal opinion within the Bureau at the time suggested it came uncomfortably close, but because of what it would mean publicly if it surfaced. The narrative the Bureau had constructed around the 1946 Battle of Alcatraz was specific and carefully maintained, a violent escape attempt by dangerous criminals, thwarted by the courage of prison staff, resulting in necessary institutional response. That narrative had no room for a prior grievance, because a prior grievance meant the men had tried the legitimate channel first. It meant the riot was not the first signal. It was the last one. The human cost of those 41 hours is documented and real. 2 correctional officers, William Miller and Harold Stites, died during the siege. 18 officers were wounded. 3 inmates were killed, including Coy, Kretzer, and Hubbard. 2 surviving participants were later tried and executed in the gas chamber at San Quentin. The Bureau's public accounting of these events placed full responsibility on the inmates. The escape attempt framing held for decades. The grievance document itself disappeared from official records sometime between 1946 and 1950. Ferris could not locate it in any archive. RM said he believed it had been destroyed, though he had no direct knowledge of when or by whom. What RM did know, because he had been in the room when it was discussed, was that senior Bureau officials reviewed the grievance's existence during the Post-Riot investigation and made a deliberate decision. They concluded that acknowledging it would set a precedent they were not prepared to live with. If inmates could demonstrate that a legitimate complaint had been ignored and that a riot followed, it created a framework. A legal and institutional framework in which prisoner grievances carried consequence. In which the Bureau's failure to respond could be understood as a contributing cause of violence rather than simply its backdrop. They chose the redaction. Alcatraz closed in 1963. The official reasons cited were economic. The island facility was prohibitively expensive to maintain, and aging infrastructure made repairs impractical. Those reasons were real, but they were not complete. By the early 1960s, a series of federal court decisions had begun reshaping the legal landscape of prisoner rights. Conditions of confinement cases were gaining traction. The idea that inmates retained constitutional protections, including protection against cruel and unusual punishment, was moving from legal fringe to mainstream jurisprudence. Alcatraz, with its documented history of nutritional deprivation, its sealed investigation files, and its unanswered grievance, was a liability the Bureau could no longer comfortably carry. Closing it was cleaner than defending it. Today, Alcatraz receives approximately 1.4 million visitors per year. The audio tour is considered one of the best in the country. The dining hall has been preserved. Rangers explain the food policy to tourists, the promise of Army standard meals, the dignified portions, the seconds available on request. It is all historically accurate. It is also, in the way that selective truth always is, a version of events. The kitchen supply records from 1944 through 1946 were never publicly released. The grievance document has never been found. David Ferris submitted his oral history research, including the RM interviews, to 2 academic journals in 1989. Both declined to publish without corroborating documentary evidence he could not provide. He donated his notes to a university archive in 1994. They remain there, catalogued but largely unread, in a collection that receives perhaps a dozen research requests per year. The 1946 Battle of Alcatraz is remembered as a riot. What the evidence suggests is that it was the second attempt. The first attempt was 3 pages of careful handwriting, 34 signatures, and a formal request that the rules everyone agreed to actually be followed. That attempt was ignored in 18 days. The second one took 41 hours and 6 lives to end. Somewhere in a federal archive, or destroyed long before anyone thought to look, is a document that might have changed the outcome. The system saw it, reviewed it, and decided the cost of responding was higher than the cost of whatever came next. It is worth asking how many institutions, in how many forms, are making that same calculation today. Because history does not always announce itself before it repeats. If this story stayed with you, the next one goes deeper, and the records are even harder to find.